Good morning, all of you. When Mr. Balasubramanian was quite keen that I should participate in this event, I was really not sure about my suitability for this. Because I suffer from an identity crisis. I was introduced as a chartered accountant. But many chartered accountants, or most chartered accountants, think I am a journalist. And the journalists do not want to accept me as journalist. They would like me to be classified as a chartered accountant. So wherever I go, there is an identity crisis. Is he a journalist? Is he an editor? Is he a corporate advisor? So on what basis I have been chosen to share my thoughts with you? You people are concerned with quarterly results, annual results, and it creates palpitation in you as well as the investors and of course the promoters. But I am concerned with a slightly longer idea of the economy and the nation. So how to combine these two differing perspectives is also a challenge for me. Normally you call a person who is a very good speaker. In fact, in Srimad Bhagavatam, one of the earliest literatures of India, it is said in Kali Yuga, that is the present day in which we are living, good speakers or orators will be mistaken for scholars. So if somebody speaks well, he will be assumed to be a scholar. See, I am neither a scholar nor a great speaker. So in what category you have brought me in also, I do not know. So with all these caveats, I would like to share my thoughts with you. Because when somebody is, in the introduction, you always exaggerate the worth of a person so that the persons who have invited that person is not underestimated. So when this kind of introduction is given, the expectation of the audience goes up. And to rise to that level and to satisfy you is a challenge. That's why I am putting all these caveats, so that I would like to share my thoughts with you about what I think we, as a very important component of India, should be doing. This is not a very ordinary group. It's not easy to assemble this kind of audience, talented, competent, working on the ground, and at the same time connecting the world with India and India with world. It's an audience of quality. So we need to have a much higher helicopter view of what's happening around us and the world. But unfortunately in the Indian discourse, there is not only bias and prejudice, there is really no India-centric discourse in this country. This has been one of my very concerned idea, the area of great concern for me, that in a country which is 1/6 of humanity, which boasts of the intellectual talent of a very high order, it doesn't have an India-centric thinking. And I would like to bring before you how the world has turned in the last 20 years or so, but the Indian debate and discourse remains where it was 25 years ago. I would like to show how there have been 4 great tectonic shifts in the world. One is, now the shelf life of ideas is coming down rapidly. Colonialism lasted for 200 years. Capitalism lasted for 100 years. Communism lasted for 50 years. Globalization is running out of steam in just 25 years. So there has been a great stress on idea generators as to how to lead the world with a long-term idea. And for a corporate, I told you, you have a great challenge of the quarterly results. In fact, I was told that President Trump, who has brought about so many changes, is also thinking of dropping the quarterly results. If he does it, not only America, the world will benefit. So all our entire drive, energy, our vision is sometimes limited to quarterly results. You see, for a society, for talented people, for people who are supposed to provide leadership, a short-term goal should not be an obsession. But unfortunately, it has become so in the financial world in which all of us are operating. Second thing is, in the last 25, 30 years, there is a huge shift taking place from the Euro-West to Asia. In terms of economic power, in terms of military power, in terms of technological power, in terms of, most importantly, demographic power. 50 years back, population was regarded as a burden. Today, it is regarded as an asset. Demographic economics has redefined the idea of population. Imagine India had a population of only 50 million. Who will bother about India? But when we say we are 135 million, at the same time, we feel the strength of it and also the challenge before us. So, the shift towards demography as a very important component of geopolitical and geoeconomic strength and power, Asia is coming into the center stage of the world. So, the shift from Euro-West to Asia is very important, and I will tell you how India and China are leading this paradigm. Even though there are conflicts, whichever nation rises up, it will have challenge from some other nation. So simply because there are challenges between India, Japan and China, it doesn't mean that Asia is not rising or the Asian sense is not rising or Asian values are not rising. How it is going to have impact on the whole idea of economic development model is something which I would like to introduce you to. The third thing is the rise of India itself. No one thought India would ever rise, and I will tell you the reasons why it was presumed India is not a country which was destined to rise. And it was a globally determined, globally accepted and a globally decided proposition that India could never develop. When I tell you this, you will be surprised as to how India began developing in spite of the great philosophic, economic, political and social pronouncements against India, that this is not a country which was destined to develop. Till about 20 years ago, this was the opinion at the global level. So, that India is now rising. Its soft power is rising, its hard power is rising, its economic power is rising, its intellectual power is rising, and nobody is in a position to ignore India. So, this is a very important tectonic shift from the Indian and Asian perspective. The third thing on which I will focus a little more is that the whole world was looking at a one-size-fit-all model till about a decade ago. Now that one-size-fit-all model has been virtually given up by the propounders and expounders of the model itself. This is very important for us because we are operating in this country, and this is not a country of a size which the world could ignore, nor it could ignore the world. Because the very size of India makes India relevant for the world, and its very size makes the world also relevant for India. It is not one of those small country of 50 million population or a country which you can walk across in one night. So we have got to take these four important shifts which has taken place in the last 50 years or so to understand how we should be looking at the global economy, the Indian economy, and also our own corporate's role in the ecosystem. You know, the origin of this one-size-fit-all model started with William Archer, who wrote in 1870 that Indian society is basically a barbaric society. This is how colonialism began redefining India to the world and to us. And even some of our own people began behaving as if we are a barbarous or semi-barbarous society. And on top of it, in the year 1853, Karl Marx wrote a couple of articles in New York Herald Tribune, which is called the International Herald Tribune now. that is a very peculiar society. It has some kind of common living model. People move from one end of the country to the other without disturbance. Their waterways are taken care of, roadways are taken care of. Though there are several states, there is one idea that seems to constitute this country. But unfortunately, this country has not changed for 2000 years. Its economy is organized on the basis of villages. Each village seems to be so independent, it doesn't need anything from any other village. And the distance between the producer and the consumer is so little, there doesn't seem to be much exploitation also. Having said this, he said this society is destined to be and remain a semi-barbaric society, an improvement from what William Archer said, and said that this is worshipping monkey and cow. How can the society grow if you are going to worship monkey and cow? And so the British are doing the right thing by demolishing the social and economic architecture of India. And it is a painful destruction, but it is a pleasurable destruction also. The man never came to India. He never met any Indian. He never had read any Indian literature, but he became the most influential thinker, dominating our minds, which his thoughts do even now. Then came Max Weber. Max Weber was a man who theorized the impact of philosophy and religion and sociology on economics. And he theorized that these Protestant nations are going faster because they promote individualism, they promote enterprise, they promote entrepreneurship, and Catholic societies are lagging behind because they are under enormous amount of the weight of the church and the hierarchy. And individualism is not the core of the Catholic society. And so he saw a paradigm difference between the two. And he was right, because he studied it for almost 2 decades and came to the conclusion that all the Protestant nations are moving forward and Catholic nations are lagging behind. But after 20 years, he wrote in 1917, The Religion of Hinduism, The Religion of India, and another book, The Religion of China, in which he said these two societies can never come up economically because they believe in karma and rebirth. He at least read some Indian literature, but he never came to India, never discussed with any Indian. These two persons exerted the greatest amount of influence on Indian academia, Indian intellectuals, Indian policymakers. And what they said constituted the Western approach to development, that unless a society restructures itself on the thinking, philosophy, model, and methods of the West, it can never grow. What I am saying is not something which is an inference. This is what the United Nations said in the year 1951 as an advisory to the underdeveloped nations. There is a sense in which rapid progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped. Old social institutions have to disintegrate. Bonds of caste, creed, and race have to burst. And large number of people who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. Very few nations are willing to pay the price for economic progress. This is where economic progress was linked to the society giving up its own way of life. This was 1951 United Nations. This was completely taken by the speech which Truman delivered in 1948 as the New Deal for the world. All this is put together and consolidated and presented as the Western anthropological model. This is contract-based lifestyle, individualistic, atomizing the societies, atomizing the families, and this model has grown. And today what you see in America is the manifestation of this thought. And we must understand it to contrast what we are, where we are, and how it is different. Unless we know that the idea that one size fit all model is necessary for India, that will continue to persist even though the West itself has changed its opinion. So, you see in America today, 51% of the families do not have the father and the mother living together, or there is no father at all. 41% of the children born are born for unwed mothers. And 51% of the families are dependent on the state. All the responsibilities which the families are supposed to handle and are handling in India are being handled by the state. Families have been nationalized. It's a very serious issue to examine. In fact, Milton Friedman and other economists met in 1983 and precisely warned against this in America, that don't bring in universal social security, that will destroy the family system. And once you destroy the family system, you will not be able to build up a society, of which the family system is the fundamental thing. He said, you bring in universal social security, everybody will feel freed from the responsibilities they have towards one another. And that has happened in the last 40-45 years in the United States. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, we see a very different approach to economy, savings, investment in this country. And how is it different? And how the rise of Asia has made the West to think this one-size-fits-all model won't work. And that has been admitted by the G20 nations for the first time in October 2005, where the finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 nations met and stated this. We recognize that there is no uniform development approach that fits all countries. Each country should be able to choose the developmental approaches and policies that suits its specific requirements. This is October 20, 2005. I don't think any newspaper even discussed about it in India. I don't think any columnist even wrote about it. I don't think there was any editorial. I don't think there was any discussion in Parliament. G20 nations say that we have no more to give you a model common to all. It is very clear. There is no single economic theory which functions for all nations in the same way. For example, take America. From 1976 till now, America has been running trade deficit, except for 2 years under Clinton. And they have run a trade deficit of $10 trillion. And the economic theories say that if a country runs trade deficits continuously, its currency will depreciate, and then the whole thing will turn, and it will turn into a trade surplus. The American economy has run trade deficits for the last 35 years. But its currency value, instead of going down, has tripled. So, Milton Friedman's theory itself was given up by the US Federal Reserve System in 1997. Openly they said it, that it is no more applicable to us. So, you cannot say that there has to be one model, one approach, one policy, one way of looking at the economic model, and that is why the G20 nations came to the conclusion, beware, each country will have to work out its own model, which was not recognized anywhere, except perhaps some great leaders like Deng Xiaoping, about which I will have to make a comment to you, how he thought differently, and that is why that country is growing differently. Then May 2008, just before the financial crisis, the World Bank said, in our work across the World Bank has learned the hard way that there is no one model that fits all. And they have a sense of regret also. Development means, above all, having the ability to recognize where we have failed. This is never easy to do. It is even more difficult for the World Bank, which has been constantly advocating a one-size-fits-all model. I have not seen any article by any Indian scholar, policymaker, columnist, no statement by any finance minister that this is what the G20 nations have said. This is what the World Bank has said. So we have to begin thinking for ourselves. Absolutely nothing. Then in the year 2010 and 13, the very United Nations which said that you have to give up your way of life, your culture, your philosophy, your beliefs, if you have to develop economically, they said in 2010, development must be nationally driven, rejecting the one-size-fits-all approach to eradicate poverty and foster economic growth. In 2013, for the millennial development goal, they said culture should be the foundation for economic growth. Why I am mentioning this is, that even today this is not what informs the Indian debate discourse. So we need to look at how the society functions, how the polity functions, and the functioning of the Indian economy cannot be very different, divorced, distanced from how the people behave. We are a family-oriented society. What is the impact of this? Because we are a family-oriented society, this is a debate which I had with Kumar Bhattacharya, who recently passed away. He told me, Guru, you should not be opposing privatization, you are opposing privatization. I said, I am not opposing all kinds of privatization. Of course, whether railways can be privatized or not is something on which a huge debate has to go on, because Indian Railways transports the whole of Australia every day. It's not easy for some corporate to say, I will come and run it. So it's a huge problem. And then I asked him, which is the biggest public burden of the government in the West? He said, social security and health security. I asked him, can it be privatized? He said, no. Because to privatize social security and health security, you need families. You cannot create them by law. You can destroy families by law. You cannot create them by law. But in India, social security and health security is largely privatized because of the idea of family and relationship. This relationship is a very important component of the Indian economy, which decides not only how people relate to each other, but how do they invest? How do they save? Which instrument they choose? If Indian economy is not choosing equity as a prime instrument, contrary to what American investors are doing, the important reason is the idea of family. They do not want to risk their capital. We did a research in Coimbatore. We took a survey of lady financial and economic professors in 70 colleges and asked them, what is your savings model? They said, first it is bank, and then some house, and then some land, and then some chit funds, and then some. And finally, only out of 272, 5 or 6 people mentioned we also look at equities. So we asked them the last question, that you teach in the class, equity is the best model of investment to beat inflation, to grow. But when your personal investment comes, you don't invest it like that. He said, that is only for teaching, that is not for saving. This shows how the theoretical India, the India of the public discourse that is taking place, is very, very different from the functioning India. It's not very different in Japan. In Japan, only 9% of the Japanese savings gets into stock market. Even though Japanese stock market, Tokyo stock market has the most advanced financial instruments to deal with. 51% of the Japanese savings are in bank deposits. And the greatest amount of interest that is paid on bank deposits in Japan is 0.8% for a 5-year deposit. People would still invest in a 5-year bank deposit carrying 0.8% return than equities, which may bring several times that return but carries a risk. This depends upon a society's mindset, how they relate to each other. In all relationship-oriented societies, my study is that equity investments are less, fixed and safe investments are more. Has there been a discourse in this model? Actually, in Brookings Institution, one economist by name Bobsworth, he studied the differential between the Asian model of savings and the Western model of savings. And he designated the Asian model of savings as dynastic savings and the Western model as individualist savings. Why is it dynastic model savings? Nobody saves for himself, he saves for his grandson or granddaughter. Huge difference. This is not what informs the economic model in India, economic discourse in India. So, there is a mismatch. And this mismatch is very, very critical if we have to understand how we go about handling this It is because why we don't look at ourselves, why we look at only what's happening elsewhere. It is because of the continuous stream of thinking that somewhere we are a failure in economics. We have been great in philosophy, arts, music, culture, architecture. In everything, India has been great. But somewhere in the field of economics, we have been a failure. And that is how Karl Marx or Max Weber or Archer or the colonialists who came here, they always made us feel that you have not been great performers in economics. With the result, in 1978, Professor Raj Krishna was asked by the media, how is it that we are following the same socialist policies as the Western nations are following, Yugoslavia, Russia, and East European nations? They are posting much bigger growth rate than we, even though we follow the same policies. So he came up with a fantastic explanation. Whatever policies we follow, we can have only the Hindu rate of growth. That is how the Hindu rate of growth came. This was 1978. This one sentence was pulled out by Robert McNamara, who addressed at least 2-3 conferences all over the world, that here is a society which will always be in poverty, which can never grow. I beg aid for this country. This is how Robert McNamara branded India, because we branded ourselves like that. But something stunning happens in 1983. Paul Bairoch was mandated by the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff to capture the economic growth model of the world between 1750 and 1900, and he came out with his publication in 1983, where he said, in the year 1750, China was leading the world with 34% of world GDP, India with 24.5%, and England and America put together 2%. This shook the world. 2/3 of the global GDP was in China and India. America and England put together 2%. Then many Western thinkers began writing, let us admit, in the 16th and 17th centuries, India had a much better standard of living than us. Especially the French historians began writing like that. So, the OECD nations constituted a development studies institute of Angus Maddison, the greatest economic historian ever. And Angus Maddison studied for the next 18 years the economic growth model from the first year of the Common Era to 2001. And he mapped it saying the first 14 centuries, India was the leading economy of the world with more than 28 to 34% of world GDP, China number 2. China became equal to India in 15th century. And China overtook India in 17th century, India overtook China in 17th century, and both were overtaken by others in the 19th century. That is how the theory of colonial exploitation as the root cause of India's economic destruction, the first author who proved it was Angus Maddison. When I mentioned all this in the IIT Bombay in 2010, because the speaker who spoke before me raised this point of the Hindu rate of growth, that as a civilization we cannot grow. Exactly the same thing what the United Nations said, that unless you give up your philosophy or way of life, you can never grow. This was the line of thinking. So when I mentioned all this to the IIT audience, they all surrounded me and said, sir, we know nothing about these things. We are not taught these things, that this is the economic growth history of India. And so they made me teach the Indian economic growth model for 4 years in IIT Bombay. So you can understand the extent to which we suffer illiteracy about ourselves. So because of that, anything Indian is inferior. I am not talking about dress, I am not talking about language, I am not talking about food, I am not talking about anything. I am talking about economics. In economics, we are not inferior to anyone. But we don't generate our own ideas. Unless we generate our own ideas, which is suitable to our ecosystem, even for a country. For example, take a company which I advise, Shriram Capital, Shriram Group. When they came to me in 1997, I told them that the brand of the non-banking financial sector is so poor. Unless you correct that brand and rebrand it and make that brand acceptable, your company can never grow. This is how the micro and macro are related. Many people think that your company can grow beyond the brand of the sector itself. They worked for it. And they began to lead. And the discourse is today, non-banking financial companies is a very, very important component of the Indian financial system. In the rainbow model of India, this is a very, very important role to play, was established because of the challenge that one corporate took. That's how we have got to, wherever we are operating, if our size is such that, or the sector is so important, then we have to do a macro thinking for that sector. And there is no equivalent of this anywhere in the world. This non-banking financial company model is an extension of the Indian informal money lending model. And how it has been sustaining the Indian economy is something which has not been understood at all. And how, now I will come to Deng Xiaoping, how he captured the very essence of how China has to develop only by funding the small scale sector through the state. When Deng Xiaoping took the challenge of repairing the Chinese economy was in such a bad situation. Actually, in 1957 to 60, in 3 years, 30 million Chinese died of hunger. And the news itself came only in 1978. In fact, Amartya Sen was the person who theorized that for economic development, freedom is necessary. And he compared with India, that if there is one hunger death in Kalahandi, the parliament will stop. Food will be airlifted. That's how distribution was made, not only an economic issue, but a political and social issue. But in China, it did not happen, so that 30 million people died. So, that was the inheritance of Deng Xiaoping, how he handled. This is a beautiful book, Deng Xiaoping and the Modern China, is the book that was written by 2 Harvard scholars. And there the real description of how Deng Xiaoping lifted 150 million people from the poverty line to above has been described by Deng Xiaoping saying that we have to focus on the town and village enterprises. 28 million town and village enterprises was the focus of his economic activity for the first 10 years. He funded them, he ensured that they grew, and it is they which provided the maximum 128 million employment they provided. There he gave only one mantra to his economic thinkers, his policy makers, his bureaucrats, and even the media. He said, you listen to everybody, but follow what will work in and for India, for China. You will be surprised that India is the next country to do that. In the Niti Aayog resolution, perhaps most importantly, the Niti Aayog must adhere to the tenet that while incorporating positive influences from the world, no single model can be transplanted from outside into the Indian scenario. We need to find our own strategy for growth. The institution has to zero in on what will work in and for India. This is the most critical thing. As a result of which emerged the Mudra finance model. Mudra finance model is a lateral intervention into the economy. We have 58 million non-farming units, employing 28 million people, but the bank and organized finance for this sector was just 5%. It is the informal lending which was taking place at 60%, 90%, 120%, 360%. This no market economy will do this. It requires a specific intervention in the Indian context through a model as a state policy. This is what I call as India-centric thinking. This is lacking in this country, and as some who are playing a very critical role in the financial intermediation of India, This is something about which all of you will have to think. This entire sector has to think, but some will have to take the lead. Today we are trusting the government to think for all. No, the government cannot think for all. The government, we have to think for the government also. There were days when you could go to the government with a petition and an application for the government to say yes or no. Today you have to tell the government, this is the position, this is the plus, this is the minus, this is what we will do and this is what you have to do. There has to be a proper education of the system itself. In fact, the Indian industry, the Indian financial system has not changed from the days of the socialist order. It is merely pleading with the government, do it, but you have to offer solutions to the government, for which we need to constitute researchers. I have not come across many industry institutions constituting researchers as to how this problem A can be handled, problem B can be handled, problem C can be handled. In fact, in my discussions with many institutions of very high policy making, I don't want to mention names, everybody thinks only about that institution. It doesn't think about how it has to work with other institutions. There is no supervening economic policy architecture in this country. There is no collective economic opinion making. These are all affecting the Indian growth story. India is poised for very high growth is something which is admitted. It will happen in spite of all this, in spite of the government, in spite of this lack of opinion making, because there is an Indian energy flow, and which I have studied, which I have personally experienced in 1991-92 when this tsunami of globalization hit India. And none of my clients or friends in the high industry knew how to react to it. I decided to take a travel across the country, taking the advice that Mahatma Gandhi was given by Gopal Krishna Gokhale, to understand what is the basic strength of the society. I went from Ludhiana to Batala to Rajkot to Jamnagar to Morbi, right down to Thoothukudi. 6 years I studied, cut down my profession to the minimum possible. And then I came to the conclusion there is so much of entrepreneurial energy and talent in this country. What we read in the Economic Times or Business Standard or Business Line has nothing to do with that energy that is flowing in this country. You may be surprised. Of course, I have put this question in many of my speeches which may have appeared in YouTube. Which is the place with the highest per capita income in India? I will tell you which are not the places. It's not Bombay, it's not Delhi, it's not Calcutta, it's not Chennai, it's not Hyderabad, it's not Bangalore. It is a place called Morbi in Gujarat, where you have 1,000 ceramic units, 150 diamond cutting units. You have 2 huge wall clock manufacturing, Samay and Ajanta. The population is only 250,000. 150,000 is employed. Highest employment rate in the world. The only language they do not know is English. You go to Tirupur. Tirupur was studied not by any Indian institution. It was studied by the Boston Consulting. Chari, a Boston Consulting expert, wrote a book, Fraternal Capital, about Tirupur. I never knew about Tirupur, being from Tamil Nadu. It's not a place connected by airways. It's not even a place connected by 4-way roads. It is posting $6 billion knitwear export turnover. 68% of the exporters are educated, less than 10th standard. Only 7% are graduates. They were growing cotton because it's black soil. From growing cotton, they began doing cotton ginning, they began doing spinning, then they began doing weaving, then they went into knitting. So the world saw that there is some development taking place in a place called Tirupur. They didn't know which place it was. And they the Boston Consulting sent a team to study this place. This entire report was summarized and put in the World Development Report 2002. I have not seen many Indian people writing how in a small place, who were farmers earlier, have become exporters now. And that is the only place where I said, sir, this evening US Federal Reserve System is meeting. I don't know what will be the interest rate. I have not heard many corporates talking about it. This is where I found something very, very different is taking place. The community-driven entrepreneurship, family orientation, savings being circulated among them. It's a huge social capital which is working under the ground, unrecognized, unidentified, and unpromoted. And that is the real strength of India. 92% of Indians are self-employed. We talk about employment. Employment can, see, both communism and capitalism suffer from a huge problem. Both of them need employers and employees. Without employers, capitalism will not work. Without employees, communism will not work. And there is no great difference between the two. The difference between the two is only who should own the wealth, whether the individual or the state. It is only the property dispute. Otherwise, how the wealth should be put to use, on that also there is no difference between the two. And we were caught in the debate between the two. We forgot the society. In the West, there is a huge debate developing between market economy and market society. Market economy is what we see the market. Market society is you bring market principles into the family also. So in 2009, when the Asian economies rebounded, the Economist wrote an editorial. Sometimes the Economist magazine writes the truth also. So they said, how Asia rebounded? Because the Western nations have become market society. Japan and Asian nations operate only market economy. They have not given up the social relationships. This is very, very important. So we are working, particularly in the financial field, this is more pronounced. Trust is very important in India. Client relationship is very important in India. These are all based on local cultures, value systems. If you take Karur, which is a place with 7.5 lakh population, which has posted 2 big banks. Has anyone studied how a small place like Karur could post 2 big banks? And there are 54 branches of nationalized banks. But still, people borrow only from non-banking financial institutions. 2/3 of the credit is supplied for the handloom export-oriented units there. Only because they only know when they need money, they will give it to them in 24 hours. An economic model that is relevant for this area is functioning, which the institutions of India will not recognize. They will say all non-banking financial institutions must be closed. They must all be put to this one-size-fits-all rule. These are all issues. So my request is, which I make in many platforms, which I make here also, in the life of Maharishi Aurobindo, there is an incident. Aurobindo had come from Bengal to Pondicherry. The British had crushed the entire revolutionary movement. There was pitch darkness everywhere. Nobody was talking about freedom. So Aurobindo, everybody was looking to Aurobindo. He was a great intellectual, educated abroad, come back to India, fought the British. And so everybody was looking to him for advice. So he was looking to a mad mystic called Kullachami, about whom Subramanya Bharati has written poems also. So everybody was worried what has happened to Aurobindo. He is looking at a madman when we are looking at him. So one day at the backyard of his house, Aurobindo was sitting and having a cup of tea with 5 of his friends. Kullachami came and lifted the teacup in front of Aurobindo and showed it to him. It was full. Then he emptied the teacup and showed it to him. Then he placed the teacup and went away. Aurobindo said, I have got my message. So his friends asked him, you have lost the tea. Please tell us what message you have got. He said, you empty your thoughts and begin thinking afresh. This is what the Indian intelligentsia should be talking. Thank you very much.
Once again, just a round of applause for Mr. Gurumurthy, sir. So we'll be doing, as I'd been mentioning earlier, we've got your questions from the app. Mr. Gurumurthy would prefer to do it standing, which is great because it shows that he's fit and healthy, which is fantastic in this day and age. So the first up, so the questions, these are questions that have come on the app. We have the Voyage 2019 app and all the members here have downloaded it and they've been sending their questions on it. So first up, they ask you, how can financial sector and its regulator help in making the most out of India's demographic dividend? You were speaking about that earlier, so just your thoughts on this.
You see, I think we have to move over from from being hooked to the Western idea of financing in this country. I'll tell you a very prevalent model of financing in 3 districts of Tamil Nadu, which is called Moi Ezhudhal. Maybe Mr. Balasubramanian will be able to tell you what it is. This is generations after generation people maintain registers as to how much we have presented in a marriage or other functions of other families. And that is something which you have to do in return. So if you are connected with 3,000 people, for all the 3,000 people you maintain a register that this is the amount they have given to us, this is the amount we have given to them, this is the net amount we owe or we are to get. And of course it is increased by some percentage every year for interest and all that. Today, I am in distress. So what I will do on the 25th of July, I will celebrate my birthday. Once I know that my registry shows that I have to receive 50 lakhs, I will send out invitations to everybody. On that basis, I will go to the bank, show my registry, and the bank will lend me money today. And when my birthday celebrations take place, the bank manager will be sitting there, and the money is collected will be handed over to him. I mean, have you ever heard this? And this is spreading like wildfire. This is society-provided social security. We have to recognize it. We have to integrate it. We have to ensure that there is a policy mechanism. Because today the banks have reached, they say 36 crore people through the Jan Dhan Yojana. Great idea. But it is not going to envelop the whole society. Their model, even though kitty party is a very important feature of many communities. So this rainbow financial model will have to be recognized and the financial sector should tune itself. In fact, the Shriram group once asked me, should we not close down our chit funds? I said, export your chit fund idea, don't close it down in this country. We think our model is poor, you can export it. There are Indian diaspora abroad, 25 million. That's almost a country. You can export it to them. Why do you want to destroy a very important financial instrument called chit fund? Simply because you think it's Indian. That is the change in the mindset that is needed. If you have to reap the demographic dividend, you have got to incorporate the habits of the people into your financial model.
So there was just a one add-on thought I had while you were speaking, while we wait for the other question to come up. You were speaking about the difference in the savings. So in India we have the dynastic savings, abroad Western they have the individual savings. How important is financial literacy, financial education at a young age? Because earlier there were joint families, people would learn from their fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers. Now more nuclear families, you learn how to earn money, you don't learn how to invest it or how to save it. Your thoughts on that?
You see, I don't agree with you that people don't learn. But the only thing is what they should learn. Like what these teachers are teaching in the class, invest in equities, and they are going to invest in properties. That kind of education which doesn't teach,
yes,
which doesn't make people internalize a habit is no good. So you have got to make financial education a bottom-upwards model. You must analyze what is the important role that chit funds play. What is the important roles that kitty parties play? What is the important role that this Moi system plays? You see, any number of financial instruments are available. I don't think we educate our students, our scholars, our bureaucrats on this.
Right. So the next question that's come in says, what are your views on a large company dominating many areas of economy by getting the rules of the game changed at will, not just for its own benefit, but also to the detriment of competition and the desirability of such domination?
I don't know how many people know it. To fight this, I went to jail. Does anyone know here? Fighting a large corporate which sets the rules, amends the rules, substitutes the rules to get over others' challenge is what I challenged in 1986. You see, it requires enormous amount of networked opinion making. It is still possible in this country, but unfortunately what is happening, everybody is thinking only about oneself. You have to think of the collective. There is no collective mind, collective forum, collective action, and collective opinion making. And that is why a person who grows to a certain level, he is feared not only by his peers, he is feared by the system also. I think it requires a lot of thinking. We require a lot of honest individuals. We don't allow honest individuals to function. In fact, we make life so comfortable for an honest man. You withdraw that comfort, he becomes dishonest. Society must respect honest people. Business people must respect honest people. Today, how many business people, in fact, this is an area of my confrontation with businessmen. How many people have really liked an honest income tax officer? You never liked. You promoted dishonesty. You promoted dishonesty for them to do a wrong thing for you. Today they are dishonest for doing the right thing for you. You completely destroyed the income tax department. The credit should go to the business people. So we must also understand that there are certain norms which we have to adopt. And one person adopting the norm can infect the society. There is a sloka in Bhagavad Gita. Yadyata charati sreshtaha tattat teva itaro janaha sayat pramanam kurute lokastat anuvartate. It's a beautiful sloka. It says how the society follows whom it considers to be the right man. If that right man is the wrong man, the society will have wrong examples. You must celebrate good people. It is the responsibility of the corporates to celebrate good people. But the corporates have failed in this country. Business has failed in this country. The result they are reaping today. So my feeling is an honest Prime Minister, a couple of honest bureaucrats, 2-3 honest journalists can bring down any corporate in this country.
Fantastic.
However wrong they are.
Superb, sir. Sir, next question. Sorry, it moved. It disappeared, but I'll ask you what it was. It said, you were saying, so the Indian mindset on entrepreneurship is changing for the positive. Okay, we'll take question number 4. Sorry, question number 3 is, what is your outlook on changes in the Indian society in the near future and its impact on the financial sector?
Plainly speaking, I don't see a huge change taking place in the Indian society. I will give you a great example of how in 1950 we started saying that we will have a caste-free politics. 1950. Now we have a caste-driven polity. You know why? That is the way we live. Yes. You cannot change it by law. You cannot change it by politics. You cannot change it by propaganda. You cannot change it by education. It has been proved in the case of caste. You must know how to live with it. So my finding is, when caste and commerce go together, it is prosperity. When caste and politics go together, it is destruction. Have you done any study? Caste-based entrepreneurship is driving the middle-level India. It has lifted the OBCs. You know, this study has been done by Harvard University. That Of the non-bank, this non-formal institution, business institution, 60 million, 60% is owned by OBCs, SCs, STs. Business is lifting them, not reservation. Reservation benefits a particular individual. But entrepreneurship lifts the entire community. Media doesn't speak about it. Government doesn't speak about it. Intellectuals do not speak about it. Even an audience like this doesn't speak about it.
Right. So the final question is, the Indian mindset on entrepreneurship is changing for the positive, but lack of financial support within forces them to look outwards. How can the financial sector address this and help develop the culture of entrepreneurship and save their sovereignty?
You see, the regulatory system in India is not in tune with the Indian financial habits. That is one of the reasons why either it is state-driven or quote-unquote market-driven. I remember in 2005, the finance minister and the prime minister of India made open statements. Don't go to banks, go to stock market. This is an open statement made by them. The government wanted to promote stock market, gave all kinds of concessions and tax concessions and all that. But the stock market did not rise. So, entrepreneurship is there on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a financial model which does not assist the development and growth of the entrepreneurship. In fact, as someone who studied, who in fact advocated demonetization and studied the impact of it, one of the things I found was that not implementing the mudra first and then going into demonetization, actually doing the reverse, harmed the entrepreneurship and financing of the self-employed people in this country. Because the society was doing that function, you took away the money from the society. So unless you bring about a substitute, the policymakers, the regulators, the economists, will have to think of what is the alternative financial model which will be in tune with the society's requirements. They are not bothered about the interest rate. If the interest rate is 18%, they are willing to pay. You may be in problem. They are not in problem. But they don't want to pay 36% interest rate. They don't want to pay 60% interest rate. So, we have to develop policies, models, institutions, regulatory order, and the retail lending mechanism, which may even charge 18% interest, but they want money. That's where we are failing. The only hope that has come is because of mudra, but it has to be scaled up.